Hi there. So we're going to be doing some pruning today. The issue is that these pear trees on either side of our driveway here have a condition called Fireblight. And I don't know much about trees. I don't know much about Fireblight, but that's not right. So what we're going to try to do is cut this back to get rid of any of the infected limbs. I don't know if I can get down far enough to save the bottommost limbs on this tree, but we'll try. You know, if this tree ends up needing to come out entirely, it's not the end of the world, because these got planted really close together by the prior owners of this house. And the canopy of that tree over there will fill in here quite nicely if this needs to come all the way out. But we'll try to save it. And there's two of them, and they're both infected. This is some type of ornamental pear variety. There are some resistant strains, so if we do decide we want to put back in some pear trees, I'd probably pick one that bore fruit worth eating and try to pick a variety that wasn't susceptible to this Fireblight. Maybe you'll see that in a future video, I'm not sure. Anyway, let's get busy trying to save this tree. So I've got some options for how I can do this. I can use this bow saw. These work great if you've got some room to get the handle in there. I could use one of those handheld, maybe fold-out saws, but I don't have one. Those work nice for tight spots. But we're going to be cutting through a decent-sized trunk over there. Electric chainsaw is my weapon of choice. Now, I love electric chainsaws because you don't have to spend 2 hours pulling on a cord the first time you go to use it. I haven't used this chainsaw, I'm going to guess, in 7 years. It's moved around from place to place with us. We've rented for a while. And again, we just sort of got into home ownership about 6 or 7 months ago, and I just haven't had really the opportunity to use it in a very long time. So I'm going to get this tuned up and ready to use on our pear trees. First thing I'm going to do is just check to make sure that the chain actually moves. You may want to put some gloves on for this, but as long as you grab the chain from the side, you're going to avoid any of these little sharp bits here. And then nicely, it actually slides pretty well. It's already in its groove. So the way this chain works is it's got some little teeth in here, and you can see a little rust on there. And that slides down into a groove in this steel track here. And as the engine turns it, it simply moves the chain along and cuts the wood. So it's a little dirty, but I don't really care about that. I'm quite sure it doesn't have any oil in it. I keep a little jug of just used motor oil. Works great in chainsaws. The oil is to cool down the blade and to lubricate it while it's turning. So it doesn't really matter if the oil's a little dirty, a little broken down from a car engine standpoint. It's going to work just great for that purpose. So, gas-powered chainsaws will have a few more mechanisms to them. And I may end up purchasing one just because I probably will have some use for a chainsaw around that isn't close enough to an electrical outlet to make it convenient to use the electric. But again, I love electric chainsaws. They work great for most light-duty work. And again, this will start right up. And even though it hasn't been used in 7 years, if I hadn't used a gas-powered chainsaw in 7 years, I would spend the day probably getting it running again. So there's an on-off trigger here. There's a little button somewhere near the trigger that is a little blade sharpener. And this chainsaw, the oil dispenser, is actually the cap of the oil cap. The button is the cap to the oil fill. And as you push that down, it pumps oil out into the end of the chain as it's running through there. I'm just going to recheck the oil here. I'm going to add a little bit more. I'm sure there's enough in there to cut our pear tree off, but we'll just make sure. All right, so I think this should be ready to go. We'll plug it in and see if it works. All right, so the kids are all in the house here, so they're safely out of the way. I am going to put my safety glasses on, and I'm going to make sure that my entire body is kind of behind this chain guard, just in case there's something really wrong with this engine that hasn't been running a while and the chain goes flying off. I want to be as safe as I can. So let's do the experiment. I'm going to give it a couple pumps of oil here before I try to trigger it. That seems to be in good working order. We'll go ahead and try using it on the tree. So here's just kind of what we're trying to get rid of. Now again, you know, the top part of this tree, this blew off last fall, the whole sort of middle part of the canopy here. And that's when I figured there might be a problem with this tree. And there's this really fungus looking stuff that's kind of growing on it. I don't think that's the Fireblight. From what I read about Fireblight, it's actually a bacteria. And I don't know, the fungus may be sort of secondary. But again, you know, I should not be able to do that with a limb that's that big around. So, like I said, we may not be able to save this tree, but I want to cut down so this branch here has got some healthy looking live buds on it, but this branch right next to it did break off, and again you see some more of that little fungusy looking stuff. So I want to go below this one. Now I've still got a nice big branch coming off the side that'll hopefully fill in the area here. And there's another one over here at the same level that will hopefully kind of be the root part of this tree now. So we're going to go ahead and cut right above those and see if we can't stop this process. And again, from what I read, you wanted to be 6 to 12 inches below the last level of disease that you know of. I don't think I've got that much clearance to save the remaining limbs on this tree, so we'll go as low as possible down here and just cut this middle part off. Now, like I said, there are some healthy branches coming off here, and there's one over here, this guy right here, and if I follow that out, it comes out a fair distance here and gets pretty close to our back door. So before I go cutting that trunk off, I want to trim this tree off just so I don't have to replace a window on a back door. Okay, just a quick word about safety. When you're running a chainsaw, always both hands on the saw. Some people might tell you you want gloves. If your hand slips off, a glove is not going to stop a chainsaw from cutting in to your finger. And I actually prefer the better grip I get with bare hands. So I actually don't like to use gloves when I'm doing most work with tools. I feel like I have more control, but I'm always very safe and very aware where my hands are. Again, they're pretty valuable to me. So let's go ahead and get started. You also want to be very careful cutting overhead. A, that you're not under something, and B, that you've got firm control of your saw, because if it kicks back, you don't want any body part anywhere near that chainsaw. Okay, so again, I'll put a couple pumps of oil, and then I'm going to keep pumping this about every 10 seconds while I'm cutting to keep that blade cool. Let's get going. And again, I'm looking up at this branch, and I can safely cut some of these smaller limbs off. And if any of them do end up hitting the house, which it doesn't look like, they're very light at that point, out at the end of the branch there. One down. The other thing you might have noticed is that when I'm cutting, I cut with the base of the chainsaw blade, and I cut as close back as I can. That gives you the most control. Again, every once in a while you end up needing to cut out towards the tip, but that's a lot less stable and a lot more prone to kickback. We'll go ahead and trim this back a little more. This branch is staying. The rest of this branch can go. And I'm going to try very hard not to damage the branches that are staying. Again, just looking for the safest place to cut here. Now, when you have bigger, heavier branches, and you want to save whatever's behind it, it's a good idea to make a quick cut up from the bottom so that you don't get what I got here, which is where as the branch starts to break off, it grabs a bunch of bark and strips it down. Now, I knew I'm cutting back to here, so I won't have that problem. And again, just kind of to make my life easy, I'm going to make this as light as possible on this main trunk here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this branch off too. And the last little branch is over here. And again, trying not to damage the ones we want to keep. Okay. I think right here is where I'm going to have the best access to cut all the way across. Okay, here's a situation where I can't get all the way down to the base of the saw, because if I do, I'm going to run into these branches over here. So I'll be a little out more toward the end, but very aware of the fact that that can cause a kickback. So my hands are always in a position where if this kicks back, that chainsaw isn't going to hit any part of my body. Alright, so from what I read, what I'm seeing here on half the bark, or half the trunk, and I'll try to get the camera and show you, is half healthy, half disease. So I'll try to cut a little more back on this side. Again, still trying to save these limbs out here. We'll see if we can do it.